This morning, we remember that Jesus' journey to Jerusalem was one marked by humility, and that we, as we seek to follow him, also must give up our pride and follow his humble way. So 4 snapshots from Scripture are going to guide our time together this morning. As you listen to each passage, I invite you to reflect. What is Jesus' word to you this morning as you seek to follow this humble way of Jesus? What do these passages say to us about how we relate to God and the way we relate to others and how we present ourselves and what we do? We begin with a scene that I made brief reference to a few weeks ago, a parable that is told in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. And it says this: Jesus told this parable to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous and who looked on everyone else with disgust. 2 people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself with these words: God, I thank you that I'm not like everyone else, crooks, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of everything I receive. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even lift his eyes toward heaven. Rather, he struck his chest and said, God, show mercy to me, a sinner. Jesus says, I tell you, this person went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. Let us hear what the Spirit is saying to us through these words. Here in this passage, Jesus ends the parable with the same phrase that we heard last week, that those who exalt or lift themselves up are brought low, while those who humble themselves, make themselves low, will be lifted up. And again, the context here is important. This is a word, it says, to people who were convinced that they were righteous and that they maybe needed to knock themselves down a peg or 2 in their own minds. It's not necessarily a word to those who have already been knocked down by others. Not a word that they just need to stay low where they are. Instead, Jesus says that in God's reign, the lowly will be lifted up. But for me, someone who sometimes has a hard time admitting my own failures and shortcomings, I find this a particularly tough word. It can be easy, can't it? To puff ourselves up when we think about how we're trying to be faithful. Maybe it's in the context of being loving, not being like those other judgmental Christians. We're the ones who love everybody, right? Maybe it's for the good deeds we do out of our trying to be faithful, doing what we think God is asking of us. And when we look around, we think, well, I may not have it all together, but I'm doing better than those folks over there. Yet when we honestly look at ourselves, our lives, we realize that we don't have it all together. We too struggle with sin, with struggling to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to, more highly than others. We too fail to love others perfectly, especially those maybe we disagree with or see as somehow different or disappointing or even, as the scripture says, disgusting. We too have need of God's grace. James Finley, in a writing that was shared with me this week through Richard Rohr's Daily Meditations, talks about this in a different way in light of the first of the 12 steps. In AA, the first step says, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. Finley says the first step then is admitting. Admitting can be a transformative act right? It goes on to say that in recovery communities, if you admit, you're admitted. If you don't admit, you're not admitted into that community of recovery. And if you admit, you live. If you don't, you die. You might die. And so he asked, what is it that makes admitting so extremely painful? The very thing that's so painful is the very thing that saves our lives. Whether we are admitting the power of addiction or judgment or something else over us, admitting, confessing, naming that thing that we are powerless over opens us up. Only in naming it and acknowledging it can we start the path to healing, being set free from it. This is why we pause to pray a prayer of confession each Sunday in worship, not because God needs us to list our failures or sins, but because doing so reminds us where God's grace and healing are needed in our own lives. Admitting that need opens the way for the need to be met. When we recognize this, we then are able to take a next step. And in humility, we then can ask for help, to not be ashamed to ask or even to beg for that forgiveness or healing that's needed, even if others are discouraging us. And this is what we see in the second little scriptural snapshot that we're going to look at this morning from Luke chapter 18, starting at verse 35, where it says, as Jesus came into Jericho, a certain blind man was sitting beside the road, begging. When he heard the crowd passing by, he asked what was happening, and they told him, Jesus, the Nazarene, is passing by. The blind man shouted, Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy. Those leading the procession, they scolded him, told him to be quiet, and he shouted even louder, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped, called for the man to be brought to him, and when he was present, Jesus asked, what do you want me to do for you? He said, Lord, I want to see. Jesus said to him, receive your sight. Your faith has healed you. At once he was able to see, and he began to follow Jesus, praising God. And when all the people saw it, they praised God too. Let's hear what the scripture is saying to us through the Spirit, through these words. I wonder if you have ever been in a situation where you needed something so badly, your pride or others' discouragement, nothing could get in your way. Or maybe some of you that comes easily, but maybe some of you are a little like me, kind of sometimes shy to speak up or advocate for what we need. We don't like to draw attention to ourselves. Some of us, if we'd been in that man's place, might have sounded more like, excuse me, sir, could maybe you, if you have time and wouldn't mind, consider showing me some mercy? And when the crowds just shushed, we might have just hung our heads and sighed. Now, I want to be careful here again that you don't hear me saying that a lack of healing means we just haven't begged hard enough or asked boldly enough. Certainly, we remember also that in Luke chapter 15 that we referenced last week, God doesn't wait for us to come, but God is like that good shepherd, the woman with the lost coin who searches us out, comes to us when we have lost our way. Yet the important point here in this story this morning is that humility doesn't mean not speaking up, not advocating for what we need, what others need. It is precisely this man's willingness to persistently shout out to Jesus, despite the shushing and the words of the crowd, that Jesus says is commendable. His tenacious faith did not give up, did not waver. He believed that Jesus could change his situation, and so he would not stop crying out, put himself out there vulnerably. Jesus stopped and listened, asked him what he needed, and offered him healing. Taking these two little scriptural snapshots together, we see that acknowledging our need and being honest with God about what we are asking God to do for us can be a path to our healing and wholeness on our journey with Jesus. Yet it doesn't mean that things will always turn out the way we hope or pray, but it is an important part of what it means to follow. And in a way, this calling out, this acknowledging their need for God's saving help is also what the crowds were doing as they waved their palm branches and shouted, Hosanna, which meant save us. So people knew they needed a Messiah, even if they thought that Jesus's saving help would take a different form than it did. As we turn our attention to these last two snapshots, we move our attention from how Jesus's followers and those encountering him acted to looking at what we can learn from how Jesus went through these last days. So we go now to Luke chapter 19, the traditional Palm Sunday reading, where Jesus, you may remember, sends two of his disciples ahead of him to find a young donkey that he will ride into town. But starting with 19:35, it says, they brought it to Jesus, threw their clothes on the colt, and lifted Jesus onto it. As Jesus rode along, they spread their clothes on the road. As Jesus approached the road leading down from the Mount of Olives, the whole throng of his disciples began rejoicing. They praised God with a loud voice because of all the mighty things they had seen. They said, blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. Let us hear too what the Spirit is saying to us through these words. In this story, we see that Jesus's humility means not being afraid to appear lowly, a different kind of king. Maybe Jesus was even intentionally contrasting himself with the Roman leaders. You know, some scholars paint for us this picture of a great parade happening on the other side of the town at the same time Jesus made his entry in Jerusalem. We know that Pontius Pilate usually came from his seaside palace into Jerusalem during Passover to keep an eye on the crowds of pilgrims that were flooding into the city for the celebrations. And it was likely a grand show of power and prestige. Pilate would have ridden on a great war horse, flanked by soldiers and guards and chariots. So that may have been happening on the other side of the city. And then we see Jesus humbly riding in on a young donkey, flanked not by soldiers and chariots, but a ragtag bunch of friends who'd been fishermen and tax collectors, sinners and the newly healed. Could it be that Jesus's entry was in fact somewhat of a protest, an embodiment of the upside down, humble kingdom of love that God was bringing? A contrast to Rome's display of power and might traditionally understood? Jesus, in his entry, was showing us the power of true peace, of justice, where instead of enforcement through oppression and violence and coercion, there would be radical and universal freedom for all to live abundantly, loving God and one another. So instead of a war steed, Jesus rides in on a little donkey. And I imagine it looked kind of silly. I mean, donkeys are not very big. I imagine as he was riding in, his feet, they might have been almost touching the ground. Hard to look very royal and kingly riding on a donkey. And it makes me wonder, sometimes if our witness to God's kingdom, to Jesus's way, might also look silly, even laughable to others, because it is the opposite of what we think of as powerful in the world, size and numbers and military might. For me, one of the most powerful stories of this is from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. You may have heard me tell this story before, but it happened on an Easter Sunday during the apartheid reign. And he had been warned to stop speaking up against apartheid in South Africa. And so they had sent soldiers into the sanctuary, lining the walls, rifles loaded. And though Tutu is small in stature, he had power beyond measure. There on that Sunday morning before all those people and those men with guns, he exuded joy. He cried out to the soldiers, laughing, "Little brothers, you know that God is a God of justice, the God of the Exodus. You know that we are going to win." You know, it looked very much at that time like apartheid was what was winning, not the way of equality and peace. But Tutu said, "We don't want you to miss out on one moment of this celebration. Join us now. The party wouldn't be complete without you." He preached against apartheid that morning, and he was not shot. His power was not the power of force or wealth or numbers. His power came from his faith that gave him the capacity for joy, for the hope of God's kingdom of love, breaking in here and now against all odds, making the powers of this world look silly by comparison. His humble yet bold faith allowed him the freedom to not be held bondage by the power of the men with the guns. It gave him the freedom to look past them and to let the grace and love of God overflow as he saw them. And so he allowed that grace and love to overflow from him to all those gathered, even those who were there with orders to kill him. Now, great spiritual leaders like Tutu and like Archbishop Oscar Romero, who eventually was killed by the forces sent to silence him, they refused to let intimidation and repressive governments and military forces keep them from proclaiming the truth of God's love for all those who are being oppressed. And we may never face something at that level. I wonder, what might God be calling us to that others may think is absurd? Showing up for and loving those who others think should be ignored, left out. Speaking out and speaking up for love and mercy, no matter what. Faithfully pursuing something that God has called us to, even though it seems impossible or ridiculous to those around us. This witness, it can be as seemingly small and tangible as what some of us will do this afternoon, picking up trash from the side of the road. I mean, removing litter from a road or two in Todd, it's just a drop in the bucket of all of the remaining plastic and waste that'll be on our roadsides and in our rivers and oceans. It's bigger than what we can imagine trying to clean all of that up. But when we stand up, when we take even small actions in care of creation in ways big and small, we follow this humble way of Jesus. Our witness is also as specific as you, maybe helping that one person that God has put in your path. Even though others may think it's not worth it, even if it seems like a hopeless cause, yet you don't give up on the possibility that transformation in their life is possible, because our God is a God of second chances and 77th chances. And the power that we see in Jesus is one that overcomes all evil, hatred, injustice with love against all odds. It's not just a sentimental love. The vulnerable love that Jesus shows us this week, this risky, self-giving love, we know will end in his arrest, trial, torture, and crucifixion as a criminal. Our final reading this morning skips us ahead a little in the story to his arrest. Thursday night, we'll go back and we'll kind of lead up to this moment we're about to read about. But it's important for us to have in mind where Jesus knows this all is heading towards Good Friday before we get to Easter next Sunday. So Luke 22:47-54 says, while Jesus was still speaking, a crowd appeared, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading him. He approached Jesus to kiss him, and Jesus said, Judas, would you betray the human one with a kiss? When those around him recognized what was about to happen, they said, Lord, should we fight with our swords? One of them struck the high priest's servant cutting off his right ear. Jesus responded, "Stop, no more of this." He touched the slave's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come to get him, "Have you come with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a thief? Day after day I was with you in the temple, but you didn't arrest me. But this is your time when darkness rules." After they arrested Jesus, they led him away and brought him to the high priest's house. Let us hear what the Spirit is saying to us through these words. Hearing this story, all that we know follows for Jesus. I think of what it must have taken for Jesus to freely give himself over, to allow himself to be arrested and taken. It was an upside down freedom. That though he was being taken, his willingness to give himself up was in fact the greatest freedom. He refused to let those around him take up arms in his defense, but yet gave himself over to those who'd come to arrest him. Last week, I started reading Peter Story's memoir. We've been in our Bible study on Wednesdays, hearing from Peter Story's son, Alan, but Peter was also a South African minister. I'm really, immersed in South Africa stories right now. He's a Methodist minister in South Africa, and in the late 1960s, he served as the chaplain to Robben Island, the prison there, famous in South Africa, that housed Nelson Mandela for many years and others who were Black freedom fighters there under apartheid. And a story he tells is about another prisoner, not Nelson Mandela, though he tells stories about him too, but of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. And it stands out to me as a story that's reflective of Jesus's posture and mindset as he is being arrested. Sobukwe had been arrested after a massacre in the township of Sharpsville. He had led many Black South Africans to burn their passbooks, the required documents that they had to carry at all times that showed their employment and what white areas they were allowed to be in. And after this, Sobukwe was labeled public enemy number 1 by the justice minister. And as Peter's story met with him one day, Peter, who is white, expressed shame that he would get to leave freely while Sobukwe had to stay there, a prisoner. But Sobukwe's response was quick, gesturing towards Cape Town and the Parliament building across the water. He said, "I'm not the prisoner. They are." I can imagine Jesus saying or thinking those same words as he was arrested and brought to trial. Though he was the one being arrested, he saw those who arrested him as the ones who were truly being held captive by their own fear, their own desire to try to preserve their power, their way of life. With a humble heart full of love, Jesus submitted to them, showed them what true freedom could look like. And in doing so, he cast his lot among those others who were facing his same fate. For the sake of living as one of us, showing us the different way of God's kingdom of love and humility, Jesus submitted to being considered what he was not, someone who was powerless, or maybe better said, someone who appeared powerless because he would not use his power to coerce or force. For us, following Jesus often means casting our lot with those who are considered lowly, and in solidarity being willing to suffer with them for the sake of love. It means holding on to a mustard seed-sized faith in difficult situations, trusting that it can grow into something beyond our imagining. It means giving up our own misguided beliefs that we can be in control, have power over our own lives or the lives of those around us. So as we think about these 4 snapshots of humility and what they mean for us as we come to the end of our Lenten journey, I invite you to think. You need to admit, confess, say before God, acknowledging where God's grace and forgiveness are needed. Once you name those, what does it mean for you to cry out, to advocate before God and others to receive that grace, to move towards healing and wholeness? And then are there ways that God is inviting you to reflect this Christ-like posture, to be ranked among the lowly, showing an alternative way of thinking and being, a way of love that contradicts so much of what the world reflects to us? In these reflections, may we find the true power of Christ's love leading us on our journey. So let us bring these thoughts and prayers before God as we hear our reflection song.